Okay, so before we get started talking about Augustine, I just want to say a couple of quick things about the midterm exam and the paper. By and large, you guys did fine on the midterm exam. The grade range was mostly in the B and C area, so that's really right where the class average should be. A few of you did not do as well. There were a few D's, and if you want to talk about how you might make sure that this doesn't happen again for the final, come talk to me. We'll talk about your study habits or whatever, whatever you might need to do in order to make sure that the stuff sticks. Okay? Right, as far as the paper was concerned, also, yeah, by and large, you guys did pretty well, right? But, again, the grade range was mostly B's and C's. So if you would like to have done better, I'm going to give you a chance to revise the paper for a better grade. So if you go into Georgia View, look at the feedback that I gave you, and revise the paper accordingly, then you can improve your score by up to 1 full letter grade. Now, I'm going to give you guys 2 weeks to do this, right? So it'll be due the Monday when we come back from break. Now, I want you to remember as well that revision is not the same thing as proofreading or editing, right? I'm not looking for you to correct grammar mistakes, right? I'm looking for you to rethink the paper. Rethink your thesis. In some cases, add a thesis. Rearrange paragraphs so that the paper follows a more logical order, right? Rethink your evidence. You may end up cutting some parts of the paper, rewriting other parts of the paper, right? I'm happy to work with you if you want my help. They'll be happy to work with you in the Writing Center as well if you want their help, right? So please do feel free to come and talk to me if you want to do revisions, and or even if you have any questions about the comments I made, right? Please do come to my office and talk to me. All right, so does anybody have any questions about this? Okay, then just two more quick points, right? One, right? I said you can improve your score by up to 1 full letter grade, right? So that means if you got a C, you can work your way up to a B. What are these people doing hovering out here?
Hope it's not a shooting.
Yeah, well, they don't look armed.
There's like a class going to a lab or something.
Yeah, I think they don't know where they're going. All right. Anywho, where was I? Right. So you can improve your grade by up to 1 full letter grade, right? I don't guarantee a full letter grade's improvement, right? It's going to depend on how good your revisions are. But I do guarantee that your grade will not go down for doing revisions. Even if you somehow manage to make the paper worse, which has happened, though not very often, right? Usually, people get about an extra half a letter grade, right? Usually that's about the average, right? But you can get up to a full letter grades improvement. Okay, right. So, with that out of the way, how'd this go for you? What did you guys think of Augustine?
It's a bit weird.
Okay, what was weird about it, Caitlin?
Just the way he talks about himself and how he's lustful and sinful and all his desires.
Yeah, well, it is called Confessions, right?
Yeah, I guess.
But one thing that we should know, let's actually go to one of these passages where he talks about his desires. Because there is actually a point to this. Or there's a reason for it anyway. If I can find it, which of course I never can when I'm looking for it. So Augustine spent most of his youth following a philosophy called Neoplatonism. So, are any of you familiar at all with the philosopher Plato? You've heard the name, yeah. All right. Those of you who have heard of Plato, what do you know about Plato? About Plato's beliefs? And silence.
I remember the allegory of the cave.
Okay, what do you remember about the allegory of the cave, Sarah?
That there's an allegory of the cave.
All right, we got some work to do here. Okay, right. So, essentially, Plato argued that the world that we can perceive through our senses is not the real world. Right? That everything that exists in the physical sensory world is just a pale imitation of an idea, right? Some higher form that exists only in the realm of ideas, right? So I can make a table because I have an idea of what a table should look like, right? Okay, it's supposed to have legs and a flat surface and, be more or less even, right? It's supposed to be this wide and that big, right? So all tables in the world are imitations of that ideal table, right? All sensory data is just an imitation of some higher idea. And if we are too attached to the world of sensory objects, then we lose interest in, or never gain knowledge of, the higher world of ideas. So I'm going to point you guys to a passage here on page 54. Thus the soul is guilty of fornication when she turns from you and seeks from any other source what she will nowhere find pure and without taint unless she returns to you. Thus even those who go from you and stand up against you are still perversely imitating you. But by the mere fact of their imitation, they declare that you are the creator of all that is, and that there is nowhere for them to go where you are not. So, right, this constant repetition of the idea of imitation that circles through this narrative, right? He's getting this from Plato, right? For Augustine, most sins are pale imitations, like inferior imitations of virtues. If we look on the next page, page 55. Right. For within I was hungry, all for the want of that spiritual food which is thyself, my God. Yet, though I was hungry for want of it, I did not hunger for it. I had no desire whatever for incorruptible food, not because I had it in abundance, but the emptier I was, the more I hated the thought of it. Because of all of this my soul was sick, and broke out in sores, whose itch I agonized to scratch with the rub of carnal things. Carnal, yet if there were no soul in them, they would not be the objects of love. My longing then was to love and to be loved, but most when I obtained the enjoyment of the body of the person who loved me. Thus I polluted the stream of friendship with the filth of unclean desire, and sullied its limpidity with the hell of lust. And vile and unclean as I was, so great was my vanity that I was bent upon passing for clean and courtly. So lust, for Augustine, is an inferior imitation of love, right? It's love without the spiritually ennobling parts, right? It's love in its gross physical manifestation, right? And remember, the Platonic idea, right, is that the physical world and its pleasures are false and wicked. Right? The spiritual and mental worlds are where you find truth, or where you find true value. Not the hardware store, value itself, yes. Okay, so does that answer your question to some extent, or your comment to some extent, about why he keeps talking about love and lust? Yeah, he's trying to demonstrate a striving towards higher things throughout his life that began with a fixation on lower things, right? It wasn't until he could get past his attachment to these lower physical pleasures that he could attain some degree of spiritual enlightenment, right? We've seen actually stuff like this before, right? This is not completely dissimilar from some of the arguments that Krishna makes in the Bhagavad Gita, right? It's not completely dissimilar even from things that we find in the Tao Te Ching. This doesn't mean, by the way, that Augustine was aware of either of those texts. He probably wasn't. All right, other questions or comments you guys have about this? Anything else you guys noticed here? Anything else that confused or surprised you?
I was just slightly surprised when it came to the part about him being agreeing to marry that young girl, and the fact that she was too young that he had to wait.
Yeah, a 30-year-old man being engaged to a prepubescent girl is, among Roman aristocratic families in this period, was not uncommon. In fact, the idea of companionate marriage generally, I think we've already talked about this, right? Of, marriage as romantic companionship is a relatively recent historical development. In Augustine's time and in his culture, right, you married in order to ensure that you had heirs of your own, from your own body to pass on your property to. And if you lived in a dowry culture, then you also probably got neat stuff. So yeah, marriage is a legal and property arrangement. It's not necessarily a love arrangement. Now he says he likes the girl, right? Now how much can a 30-year-old man like a 12-year-old girl? I don't know, but yeah, there are things about this that strike us as, at the very least, creepy, right? Especially given the other things he admits about himself, right? I mean, how long is he going to have to wait for his fiancée to be of age to be married? 2 years, right? And is he able to quiet his fleshly longings for those 2 years? So he sends away his longtime mistress who has already fathered him a child, or on whom he's already fathered a child, right? She goes back to Africa, and he takes up with a new mistress for 2 years until he can be married, right? So yeah, this whole fleshly lust thing seems to be a pretty serious fixation. Does he always seem to treat other people all that well? He often doesn't seem to take other people's feelings or desires into account, right? So I think maybe that's sort of part of the confessional here is the failure to reckon with other people's desires, other people's feelings, right? His own desires come first. Whether in his dealings with his mother, right, or his dealings with his mistresses. But I think he would sort of locate the problem being in desire itself. And that if you really want to move towards higher things, you have to extinguish the desire that connects you to the physical world. Right, this all comes back to these Platonic ideas. of the division between the physical and the mental or spiritual. All right, other questions, observations you guys have? Anything else that struck you here? Yeah, Jared.
I just found it a little weird when he was talking about just like right in the beginning when he was a student, how he's like a little sinner and all that.
Uh-huh.
And he talks about when he was a master, and he was talking about how he couldn't believe that the children were sinning and stuff. And doing
Yeah.
these things. I found he kind of contradicts himself throughout a little bit.
Yeah, and this is the thing, like, this is one thing that, all of your professors know, but will never acknowledge, right? Most of us were not good students all of the time, right? I got a D in formal logic because it was at 8 a.m. and I didn't feel like going, right? This is not a model you should follow, by the way. If you are registered for a class, go to it, right? Otherwise, I was lucky to get the D, right? But yeah, he doesn't seem, he seems surprised by the fact that the students are unruly when he is an adult and trying to teach them. Even though in a lot of ways childhood is presented as a kind of imitation adulthood as well, right? It's a preparation for adulthood. But yeah, so where was I going to go with this? It might help if we sort of moved out of talking a little bit here about the context in which Augustine is writing, because he's writing in a real sort of period of flux and change and instability. So, where did that go? No, come back. Right. So what we have here is a map of the Roman Empire around the time Augustine lived. Now, what do we notice about the sides of the map here? Do we have a single unified empire? We have a Western Empire in pink and an Eastern Empire in orange, right? This is the period in which the empire divided into Eastern and Western halves, with separate emperors and separate capitals. Right? This would have happened in the late 4th century, around the same time Augustine is writing the Confessions. So, historians like to call the long decline of Rome late antiquity. So, as far as political changes are concerned, we've already mentioned one, right? We've got the division of the empire into halves. What the hell? Right, the empire is divided. We have a series of short-lived imperial reigns, right? Emperors just come and go and come and go and come and go. Reign for a few years or a few months and are deposed. You have a bloated and inefficient military, right? An enormous military that sucks up an enormous amount of money that ends up bankrupting the empire. And at the same time they're spending all this money on their army, they're constantly threatened by the Persians in the east and Germanic tribes in the north. Right, so they're enemies at the gates, knocking and waiting to come in. And as big as the Roman army is, and as powerful as it is, and as technologically advanced as it is, it's too fractured and too unwieldy to actually defend Rome from these threats. Now, as far as economic changes are concerned, because the army is sucking up so much money, the emperors decide to debase the value of Roman currency, right? So they start putting less pure silver into coins, right? And more base metals. So the coins are worth less. And this leads to massive inflation, right? Massive rises in the price of goods. So people can no longer afford to buy things anymore. This change being instituted so that the emperors and the Senate could pay the army. Right, what else? What else is important here? Right. It's also important here to talk about social and religious changes that are happening alongside all of this. Okay, so what do we know about Roman religion? Yeah, before the empire's official conversion to Christianity, right? There were, they were polytheists, right? Now, these many gods were worshipped as part of an official state cult. So, what would happen is if you wanted to, being a priest of a particular god or a particular cult paid quite well. It was a kind of government sinecure, right? If you were a priest of Apollo, the government would pay you a certain amount of money to maintain shrines and temples, right? So these jobs were usually closely connected with people's social status. So the priesthood of the imperial cult tended to be aristocratic. Right. I promise this is all leading to something. Right, so the state cult was run by aristocrats, and the central feature really of Roman religion was that apart from the fact that you had to pay tribute to all sorts of gods from all sorts of far reaches of the empire, right, the Romans were really pretty, they were usually pretty tolerant about letting conquered regions maintain their own religious practices as long as they agreed to worship the emperor as a god. This, by the way, was one of the things that led them into problems with the Israelites, with the province of Judea, right? Was that these were people who refused to worship the emperor as a god or to acknowledge the imperial cults, right? Elsewhere in the empire, as long as you acknowledge the imperial cult, you were cool, right? Worship whatever the hell else you want. But for Jews, and later for Christians, this became problematic because their monotheism forbade them from doing this, right? You couldn't worship the emperor as a god without renouncing your other beliefs. So while the aristocracy is holding on to this crumbling official state religion, other religions, like Christianity, are gaining in popularity. So early Roman Christians were mostly people of like the lower middle classes. And skilled artisans, right? Because they had nothing to lose, financially anyway, by changing religions, right? They were the easiest people to convert because they didn't have a personal stake in the imperial cult, right? So the Roman aristocracy, to which Augustine actually belonged, the provincial part of it anyway, he's from North Africa, not from Rome itself, took the longest to convert, right? Because they had the most invested in the old state cult. Now, in addition to Christianity, there were other kind of weird religions, or we would regard them as weird and complicated religions, flourishing throughout the empire. And it's partly because the empire existed, and because all of these different far-flung provinces and cities were connected by really good roads and by, overseas trading networks, that these religions were able to spread, right? If it hadn't, there are some who have argued that if it hadn't been for the network of the Roman Empire, Christianity would have just remained a weird little Jewish splinter cults in Jerusalem and disappeared. It wouldn't have had the chance to spread. So, Augustine himself, for a time, belonged to a sect called the Manichaeans, who originated in Persia. Right, their prophet was a guy by the name of Mani, M-A-N-I. And Mani taught a doctrine that was in many ways similar to the Neoplatonism that we discussed a bit ago, right? That essentially the physical world is a trap for the soul. Everything in the physical world is designed to keep you tied to it and to prevent you from elevating yourself to a higher plane, right? The physical world is evil. It's a barrier that's in your way that keeps you from accessing the higher spiritual world, right? So Manichaeans were often vegetarians. They lived a kind of what's called an ascetic lifestyle. You're supposed to avoid certain. Avoid accumulating wealth, avoid eating certain things, in general, avoid worldly pleasures. Now, we can see also that Augustine is quite addicted to certain worldly pleasures. Right? So his Manichaean period was actually relatively brief, but influences the general way that he sees the world, right? That the pleasures of the physical world are to be denied and to be evil, are considered evil, right? Now, we can also see why a philosophy like Manichaeanism didn't last, right? Compared to a lot of other doctrines, one, it's really hard to follow, right? Requires a great deal of willpower to follow, and its doctrines are also kind of extremely complicated, difficult for an ordinary person to understand. For example, they believed that the body of Jesus lives on the moon, for various complicated reasons. Right? There's a certain logic to it, but we're not going to go into that. I just point that out. Okay. So all of these kind of mystery religions, which promise secret enlightenment to initiates, are flourishing at around the same time that persecution of Christians is coming to an end. Right? Large-scale persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire, right? So early Christian narratives are mostly persecution narratives. Right. There's stories about martyrs and, people refusing to renounce their faith under threat of death or torture, right? Now, by the time Augustine is writing, there aren't that many people being martyred in the Roman Empire anymore, right? The days when Christians were thrown to lions in the Colosseum, and that's also kind of questionable whether that ever actually happened, are by this time over. There is no more large-scale persecution of Christians within Rome. So Augustine is essentially inventing a new way to write a Christian narrative, one that is not focused on martyrdom caused by outside forces trying to get you to renounce your faith, and that is more focused on a personal inward struggle towards faith or towards religious belief, right? So the conversion narrative is inward looking, where the martyrdom narrative was outward looking. Right? It was about demonstrating the bravery of these early Christian martyrs in the face of persecution. Not really very much about their struggles with belief or how they came to belief, or even anything really about what they believed, right? It's how they faced up under duress. So Augustine is creating a different kind of duress. It's an internal struggle, internal duress, rather than external duress, right? Everybody following me thus far? Everybody with me? Now, as far as the model of this is good, the model of this that he chooses, who's he talking to through the whole of his narrative here? Who's the you in the Confessions?
God.
Yeah. It's basically a long letter addressed to God, right? Now, Augustine is probably the first person to use this form in an explicitly Christian context, but he is not the first person to use this form, right? He didn't invent this kind of narrative. This was a very common narrative technique among Manichaeans and other Neoplatonists. Now, the difference is that the Manichaeans and the Neoplatonists regarded God as remote from human knowledge, right? So these are kind of, for them, they're letters to an unknown and unknowable God, right? Because we are so blinded by the physical world, we can't see through the veil to reach God. So we write our thoughts to him, or her, or it, or whatever, to try to make some sort of contact with a divine essence. Now, Augustine has adopted the Christian idea of God, and in fact has a good deal to do with shaping what the Christian idea of God would look like going forward. But he's doing so using an old Neoplatonist technique, right? So he is taking the techniques and even the belief systems of the late Roman Empire and building a bridge with them to what much of the same kind of work of philosophy and theology would look like in the Middle Ages. Right? He's taking old techniques and applying them to a new context, right? So in a sense, what we've got here is another one of these invented traditions. I think we talked about this when we talked about Confucius, right? Right. You're creating a new practice. You're creating some kind of new tradition or idea, but you act as though people have been doing this for ages. And in fact, I mean, Augustine is sort of synthesizing an older tradition with a new idea. But I think it still sort of falls into this definition of an invented tradition. Okay, anybody have any questions so far? Everybody still with me? All right, good. So let's dig a little bit into the text of this. Actually, can I get a volunteer to read these first two paragraphs about childhood on page 47? Yeah, Lola, go for it.
What have I to say to thee, God, save that I know not where I came from when I came into this life and death, or should I call it death and life? I do not know. I only know that the gifts your mercy had provided sustained me from the first moment, not that I remember it, but so I have heard from the parents of my flesh, the father from whom and the mother in whom you fashioned me in time. Thus for my sustenance and my delight I had woman's milk, yet it was not my mother or my nurses who stored their breasts for me. It was yourself, using them to give me the food of my infancy, according to your ordinance and the riches set by you at every level of creation. It was by your gift that I desired what you gave me, and no more, by your gift that those who suckled me willed to give me what you had given them. For it was by the love implanted in them by you that they gave so willingly that milk which by your gift flowed in the breast. It was a good for them that I received good from them, though I received it not from them, but only through them. Since all good things are from you, O God, and from God is all my help. But this I have learnt since. You have made it abundantly clear by all that I have seen you give within me and about me. For at that time I knew how to suck, to lie quiet when I was content, to cry when I was in pain, and that was all I knew. Okay, thank you. You can stop there. Thank you, Laura. Very good. Okay, so in this first paragraph, right, we see here this tradition of the unknowable God, or the unknowable nature of God, being translated into this new Christian context, right? You know, he still sort of talks about not really being able to understand God's motivations, or, you know, not being able to quite reach divine understanding, right? I do not know, I know only that the gifts your mercy had provided sustained me from the first moment, right? The idea that human knowledge of the divine is limited, right? So he doesn't give us a God who's completely unknowable, but he gives us a God whose motivations are largely hidden from human beings, right? Now the other thing to note here is at the end of this first paragraph, right? Not that I remember it, but so I have heard from the parents of my flesh, the father from whom and the mother in whom you fashioned me in time. Why do you think he calls them the parents of his flesh? This isn't the only time we see him referring specifically to the flesh here, right? And what do we usually place, or what does he usually place in opposition to the flesh? Yeah, flesh and spirit are for him sort of separate things, right? Right. The garment of flesh, as he puts it elsewhere, is just a cloak for the spirit, right? It's just a covering for the spirit. So the parents of his flesh, right? Why does he call them that? He thinks God is the father of the spirit and the parents of the spirit.
Yeah, it's that same Platonic division, right, between the physical sensory object, which is just an imitation of the higher mental or spiritual object, right? The parents are a fleshly imitation of God here, right? The action of conception is a fleshly imitation of God's act of creating Augustine's soul. right? So God is the maker here of what Augustine regards as the really important part of himself. And the parents just provide him with his garment of flesh, right? The thing that covers the important bit. Now, in that second paragraph, the milk that sustains him, right? Where does that ultimately come from as well? Does his sustenance come from his mother or from his nurses? Right. All things for Augustine are attributable to the action of God, right? It is because God willed it so that it happens. It has nothing to do with the actions of any sort of fleshly agents here. Now, I'm going to sort of mention, just in passing here, a brief bit about some of Augustine's philosophical beliefs, right? So Augustine believed that God had total foreknowledge of everything that was going to happen. Everything you are going to do in your life, according to Augustine, God already knows before you were born. So, before you are even born, God already knows whether you are destined for heaven or for hell. Now, despite the fact that God knows you are going to err and he knows you are going to sin, he does not step in and stop you, because that would interfere with your free will. But he already knows which choices you're going to make and what the consequences for those choices will ultimately be. Cheery, right? Yay, fun stuff. All right. So, if we move into the paragraph that follows on page 48, later I added smiling to the things I could do. Can somebody read that for us?
Later, I added smiling
Thank
to
you,
the
Keisha.
things I could do. First in sleep, then awake. This depend I have on the word of others. For naturally, I do not remember. In any event, I believe it. For I have seen other infants do the same. And gradually, I began to notice where I was. And the will grew in me to make my wants known to those who might satisfy them. But I could not, for my wants were within me. My wants were within me, and those others were outside, nor had they any faculty enabling them to enter into my mind. So I would fling my arms and legs about and utter words, making a few gestures in my power. These beginning as amp to express my wishes as I could make them, but they were not very amp. And when I did not get what I wanted, either because my wishes were not clear or the things not good for me, I was enraged, and with my parents as though I had a right to their submission, with free human beings as though they had bound to serve me, and I took my revenge and screamed. That infants are like this. I have learned from watching other infants, and that I was like it myself. I have learned more clearly from these other infants who did not know me than from my nurses who did.
Okay, so how is his behavior different here from in the previous paragraph? Like, is he content with his lot in the first paragraph when he's just receiving milk and falling asleep? So what changes? What point in development is he talking about here? What has he learned to do in this third paragraph?
Make noise and move and be able to say what he wants.
Be able to say what he wants, right? He's learned to want things. Right? He's learned that there are things other than just enough milk to keep me fed, right? And so he begins to try to use noises and gestures to make his desires felt, right? He wants other people to know what he wants. And does he care at all what they want or what they think about what he wants? No, he's a baby, right? Babies are little tyrants. They don't care what you want, right? They don't care if you need sleep. Right? They're going to cry when they want something. And that's exactly the process he's describing here, right? A process of sort of total selfishness, right? Based on getting his wants and needs fulfilled immediately. Now, the point here is he really much different by his own depiction as a 30-year-old man than he was as an infant? Prior to his conversion. He's still pursuing his own desires, right? Regardless of their effect on others. Right? It doesn't matter to him at age 30 how his fleshly lusts might affect other people, right? Right? He wants what he wants, and he wants it now. Right? So desire, in particular desire for fleshly things, has this kind of tyrannical authority over him, right? And makes him desire this tyrannical authority over others. Now, if we look further down page 48, the next paragraph, right, all these stages he describes in his childhood development are actually really important for setting up the latter part of the narrative, right? From infancy I came to boyhood, or rather it came to me, taking the place of infancy. Yet infancy did not go, for where was it to go? Simply it was no longer there. For now I was not an infant without speech, but a boy speaking. This I remember, and I have since discovered by observation how I learned to speak. I did not learn by elders teaching me words in any systematic way, as I was soon after taught to read and write. But of my own motion, using the mind which you, my God, gave me, I strove with cries and various sounds and much moving of my limbs to utter the feelings of my heart. All this in order to get my own way. Now, I did not always manage to express the right meanings to the right people. So I began to reflect, I observed, that my elders would make some particular sound, and as they made it, would point at or move towards some particular thing. And from this I came to realize that the thing was called by the sound they made when they wished to draw my attention to it. So, what is language for him? I think there are two answers to this, right? When he acquires language, what's its purpose? Yeah, for him to express his desires so he can get what he wants, right? He connects language explicitly to desire. Now, if we look at how he learned to speak as well, what's the process?
He sees something he wants to hear, say what it is.
Yeah, and then he learns the word for it, right? So he learns the word as a kind of imitation of the thing, right? So language is a thing that is yet another step removed from that knowledge of the divine, right? From that knowledge of the spiritual, right? Because a word is an imitation of a physical object, which is itself an imitation of an idea. All right, everybody still with me? Right, good. So, this actually matters quite a great deal in that what was Augustine's profession, what was his job before he converted and became a priest? What did he do for a living?
He taught rhetoric.
He taught rhetoric, yeah, exactly. He was a teacher of rhetoric. What's rhetoric?
Reading and writing.
I mean, reading and writing is part of it, right? But yeah, rhetoric in the ancient world was a formal discipline, mostly taught to aristocratic children. And rhetoric was essentially about the use of language and gesture to persuade. So essentially, what he teaches is how to convince other people to agree with you and to give you what you want. Using words and using effective gestures, right? There wasn't, part of rhetoric, part of learning to speak well was learning how to gesture effectively. So all of these infantile activities contribute to the making of the adults whose very profession is tied up in using these various kinds of imitation in order to fulfill desires, right? Worldly desires. Right? Anybody have any questions about any of this so far? All right, everybody good? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what is probably the best known episode from this, the pear tree portion. What did you think of this? What do you think of it? His theft of the pears? Is there any point to his stealing the pears? The pears aren't actually all that good, right? They're not all that beautiful. And he ends up throwing most of them to the pigs. So why does he steal them?
Because it's forbidden to steal.
Yeah, because it feels good to break the rules, right? It feels good to do something you know is wrong, right? There's a pleasure that comes from breaking a rule. All right, let's see if where can I? Right, page 52. Right, your law, O Lord, punishes theft, and this law is so written in the hearts of men that not even the breaking of it blots it out. For no thief bears calmly being stolen from, and even if he is rich and the other steals through want. Yet I chose to steal, not because want drove me to it, unless a want of justice and contempt for it and an excess for iniquity. For I stole things which I already had in plenty and of better quality. Nor had I any desire to enjoy the things I stole, but only the stealing of them and the sin. There was a pear tree near our vineyard, heavy with fruit, but fruit that was not particularly tempting either to look at or to taste. A group of young blackguards, and I among them, went out to knock down the pears and carry them off late one night, for it was our bad habit to carry on our games in the streets till very late. We carried off an immense load of pears, not to eat, for we barely tasted them before throwing them to the hogs. Our only pleasure in doing it was that it was forbidden. Such was my heart, O God, such was my heart. In the depth of the abyss you had pity on it. Let that heart now tell you what it sought when I was thus evil for no object, having no cause for wrongdoing save my wrongness. The malice of the act was base, and I loved it. That is to say, I loved my own undoing. I loved the evil in me. Not the thing for which I did the evil, simply the evil. My soul was depraved, and hurled itself down from security in you into utter destruction, seeking no profit from wickedness, but only to be wicked. Now, does this fit into the philosophical scheme of all of this as we've discussed it? I mean, most of Augustine's conception of evil seems to come from what? Where does he seem to think evil arises from most of the time? What makes us bad? Yeah, desire, right? And in particular, desire for what? Yeah, exactly. Desire for worldly, fleshly things, right? So this would seem to be a clear-cut case of that, right? You know, that I steal the pears because I want them and no one's going to give them to me, right? So I behave badly in order to get a thing that I want. But why does that not fit into the same scheme here?
Because he doesn't even desire the pears.
Yeah, he doesn't even want the pears. It's not the pears that are tempting to him. What's tempting here is the idea of evil, right? The idea of transgression, the idea of wrongdoing. So where's this coming from? It doesn't seem to have any sort of prior precedent in the philosophy we've been talking about. Where does this desire to simply do wrong for the sake of doing wrong come from? There is an appeal to the eye in beautiful things, in gold and silver and all such. The sense of touch has its own powerful pleasures, and the other senses find qualities in things suited to them. Worldly success has its glory, and the power to command and to overcome. And from this springs the thirst for revenge. In our quest of all these things, we must not depart from you, Lord, or deviate from your law. This life we live here below has its own attractiveness, grounded in the measure of beauty it has and its harmony with the beauty of all lesser things. The bond of human friendship is admirable, holding many souls as one. Yet in the enjoyment of all such things we commit sin, if through a moderate inclination to them, for though they are good, they are of the lowest order of good. Things higher and better are forgotten, even you, O Lord our God, and your truth and your law. These lower things have their delights, but not such as my God has, for he has made them all, and in him doth the righteous delight, and he is the joy of the upright of heart. Now, we ask why this or that particular evil act was done. It is normal to assume that it could not have been done save through the desire of gaining or the fear of losing some one of these lower goods. For they have their own charm and their own beauty, though compared to the higher values of heaven they are poor and mean enough. Such a man has committed murder. Why? He wanted the other man's wife or his property, or he had chosen robbery as a means of livelihood, or he feared to lose this or that through his victim's act, or he had been wronged and was aflame for vengeance. Would any man commit a murder for no cause, for the sheer delight of murdering? The thing would be incredible. There is, of course, the case of the man Catiline, who is said to be so stupidly and savagely cruel that he practiced cruelty and evil even when he had nothing to gain by it. But even there was a cause he stated. He did it, he said, lest through idleness his hand or his resolution should grow slack. And why did he want to prevent that? So that one day by the multiplication of his crimes, the city should be his, and he would have gained honors and authority and riches, and would no longer be in fear of the law or the difficulties that the want of money and the awareness of his crimes had brought him. So that not even Catiline loved his crimes as crimes. He loved some other thing which was his reason for committing them. So even seemingly pointless acts, according to Augustine, have some end in mind, right? There's some purpose to every action. And I think that the example of Catiline here shows what exactly he thinks he was doing when he stole those pears, right? Catiline hoped, through crime, eventually to be a law unto himself, right? To be a power unto himself, right? If I am able to steal myself to be savage and cruel enough to my fellow citizens that I can take control of the city, I don't have to worry about anybody else telling me what to do anymore. And I think that Augustine is using that desire for evil, that desire for wrongdoing, as a kind of path to the same sort of freedom, right? That he thinks what that's going to get him, right? By disobeying the law and getting away with it, you demonstrate freedom from the law. I can steal these pears, and nobody's going to say shit to me about it. I don't even have to eat them. I'm just going to throw them to the pigs. Right? That's a big middle finger into the eye of society, right? And society's rules. So even this sort of fairly ridiculous instance of rule breaking for its own sake, right, serves some larger purpose or symbolizes some larger thing for Augustine. It sort of symbolizes an idea of freedom that he later abandons in submission to the will of God, right? Okay, so we're about out of time here. Does anybody have any questions about any of this? I know this is, a lot of the stuff we've been looking at has been a little bit philosophically dense. So if anybody is confused about anything, or if anybody has any questions about stuff, please do feel free to come and talk to me, right? All right, so we're going to be looking next time at a selection from the Quran, right? I only want you to read the portions labeled the opening and the feast, right? You don't have to read the whole excerpt. If you want to, great, go for it, but you're not required to. Excuse me.